It's commonly said that Dark Souls is a story about cycles, but I think it would be more accurate to say that Dark Souls is about the people who perpetuate cycles, and why. And if we want to know why, then we have to understand the cycles they perpetuate. As central to the story as the First Flame is, it's very hard to define. So today I want to talk about the First Flame, and about the Age of Fire, and share my thoughts about what exactly the fire is beyond the somewhat ambiguous order of the world. This isn't going to be a lore video, per se. I'll talk about lore insofar as I think it's relevant, but I want to speak more broadly about the overarching narrative of the Souls games. And that's a task with near infinite depth, but a lore degree isn't required here. That said, and I should have said this in my last video, but I am operating under the assumption that you're at least somewhat familiar with the Dark Souls games, and of course this conversation is made entirely out of spoilers. With that said, let's begin. The first thing we ever learned about Dark Souls was that its world was once unformed and shrouded by fog, but then there was fire. And with fire came disparity. Heat and cold, light and dark, but also more metaphysical things like life and death. We know from Dark Souls 3 that areas devoid of light, or devoid of the flame, are also void of time, its passage and seemingly its existence, so the description we're offered here in the beginning is the whole truth. Anything disparate comes from the fire, and that would naturally make the fire very important to the inhabitants of the world, because disparity is a fundamental component of our very human and subjective view of meaning or purpose. Heat is tangible to us as a word and a feeling because we know what it is to be cold. Death is foreign to us, it's intangible in a sense, but we know that it's a state of being void of life, and so we have the capacity to fear it. In a realistic sense, disparity allows things to be and to exist at all. Today to be different from tomorrow, for you to be different than your friends and family, for death to be a state other than life, and for us to be able to have this conversation at all, is all contingent on disparity. Disparate concepts are the only thing we can actually understand. And it's for that reason that a world without disparity is unknowable to us. It doesn't make any sense. But defining disparity in Dark Souls is more complicated than just mapping its real-world equivalent onto the games. We know that life and death, heat and cold, those concepts didn't exist before the coming of the First Flame, but we also know that the world was not truly empty before the fire came into being. It was full of arch trees and everlasting dragons. And there's an argument to be made that people, not humans, but people, existed in some capacity before the coming of the fire. The wording of the opening cinematic is quite vague, and it's also a translation of what would have been intended when written in Japanese, but it stated that fire was born, and then from the dark they came, and found the souls of lords within the flame. The wording used here seems to suggest to me that people were conceived upon the coming of the First Flame, and Nito's existence implies the same thing. He's the first of the dead, and the dead could not have been before the flame. So it's most likely, in my opinion, that the world was unformed, and that whatever the everlasting dragons were doing couldn't be called living. Not in the sense that we understand it anyway, as an act that's finite. So when fire was born, and disparate concepts came into the world, creatures capable of embodying those concepts followed. That makes the most sense to me, but it is entirely possible that Gwyn and his knights, Izalith, and other people did exist before the flame, but that again, whatever state they inhabited could not meaningfully be called life. Either way, the important thing to take away from the opening cutscene, and from its depictions of a world before disparity, is that there is some way to exist in a world without disparate concepts. So, an unanswerable question in the real world is answered for us in the games. There could indeed be something in a world of nothing. So, what would that something look like? Earlier I made a point of distinguishing people and humans, and that's because human in Dark Souls means something very specific. The fourth Lord Soul found after the birth of fire, the one so often forgotten, was the Dark Soul. And where the other Lord Souls drew their strength from the flame, the Dark Soul drew strength from its absence. And when Gwyn and Izalith and Nito took that strength for themselves, the furtive pygmy instead shared the power of his Dark Soul with his people, who would later become known as humans. The fire sustains the Age of Gwyn and his compatriots, the Age of Gods, as it's called. When it fades, the order of the world will pass on to humans, those who draw strength from the darkness. Gwyn feared this reality, and in order to hold on to his power, his Age of Fire and strength, he links the fire and brands humans with the dark sign, and thus they're shackled for eternity to link the fire in his stead. Were it to fade, the Age of Dark would be for nothing, as the undead curse, which ensures that humans continue to resurrect after death until they lose their minds and go hollow, would ensure that an Age of Dark, whatever it meant, would come too late for anyone. Or at least, that's how the story goes. But if you'll humor me for a moment, I don't buy it. Not in its entirety, anyway. The Age of Fire is good for Gwyn, that goes without saying, and so separating his choice to link it from a desire to hold on to his power is almost impossible. But I think, at the very least, we can arrive at some interesting conclusions if we try. What is a god? That's a difficult question to answer. I think most people probably have some idea, some image in their head, but of course our answers are all going to vary so much for so many reasons. Geography, age, culture. But what I think is interesting about the word God, for the purposes of this discussion anyway, is that in Dark Souls, it doesn't seem to mean anything at all. Gwyn did not create the world. And that's not unique. There are plenty of deities across cultures who aren't responsible for the formation of the world or the universe, but Gwyn also doesn't seem to have any power over it. What power he does have, he draws from the fire. He draws from the world that he was born into. And that power is immense, don't get me wrong, but when the world turns against him, he can stand no firmer in the face of change than anyone else. And in linking the fire, he throws himself away. His age may go on, but it won't belong to him anymore. And it's tempting to see that as a commentary on power and the ways it can corrupt. It doesn't have to make sense, after all. He just can't bear to see his power escape him. But as I alluded to before, I don't buy it. And I don't buy it because power is not the only thing born of fire. Hollowing sucks. It's the inevitable fate thrust upon humans by Gwyn. And it's a very clever punishment, because so long as hollowing remains our fate, we have nothing to gain from the Age of Darkness. We'd be on top, but what does being on top mean if we've lost our minds and our purpose? If we're doomed to wander as tortured shells for eternity? Surely no power, no matter how great, could be worth that fate. But how am I to believe that, if kingship was truly all that Gwyn sought to protect in the linking of the fire? But of course it wasn't, because Gwyn feared more than that his strength might flee him. Gwyn feared humans. Gwyn feared the dark. The dark is an unknown, and its true nature is something that we can only ever guess at. But we do know what it would lack. Were fire to flee it, the world would be void of light, and of time, and all else that could be called disparate would surely follow. And whatever state that humans could inhabit, whatever form we could take in the Age of Dark, I don't think it could be called life, no more than the everlasting dragons had life. That Gwyn feared such a power in humans. That at the center of man could be a void so deep that no life could survive it. That I could be no different from you. That today could be no different from tomorrow. That life could be so cold and empty and hollow as death itself is a thought that scares me. For all that we suffer at his hands, and for all that he rightly burned to ash for, Gwyn did have something to fear. Something real, something tangible, and maybe we too have something to be afraid of. Lordran and Dranglake, and most certainly Lothric, are horrible. They're nightmares. So full of pain, and violence, and fear. But fear is all that the fire ever did promise. To fear is to have something to lose. To despair is to have known loss for yourself. And to hurt is to have all that you love burned away by the wretched fire that makes such beautiful and pointless concepts possible. In the dark soul of man lies a kind of freedom, an absence, a world void of disparity. Gwyn was alone before the fire, and his choice would have been as clear as the daylight he so cherished. A broken and disparate world, or an empty one.